Hello, and welcome to the Western Hemlock Zone. My name is Whitey Lueck. We're just several miles south of McKenzie Bridge in the West Cascades, Central Oregon Cascades, at about 1,500 feet elevation, in the middle of what is the most extensive forested zone in Oregon. The Western Hemlock Zone extends from just inside the fog belt, so just a few miles from the Pacific Ocean, all the way up and over the Coast Range, then into the West Cascades, up to as high as about 4,000 feet. That's east to west. From north to south, the zone extends from about the Coquille River in the Coast Range, which is around Bandon, all the way up north to the Columbia River. And then in the Cascades, it extends from about Crater Lake National Park up to, again, the Columbia River. So topographically, in terms of elevation, it goes from about sea level to over 4,000 feet. The climate in this area of the Western Hemlock Zone is warmer in summer and cooler in winter than the fog belt where the Sitka spruce predominates. And it's warmer in the summer and warmer in the winter than the higher elevation zones here in the Cascades, the Mountain Hemlock Zone and the Pacific Silver Fir Zone. Geologically, the Coast Range forests, Coast Range part of the Western Hemlock Zone, is almost all sedimentary rock. They're old marine sediments that have been lifted up above sea level over the millions of years. Here in the West Cascades, the rocks are almost all igneous rocks, volcanic rocks, most of that basalt. So let's take a closer look now at what makes the Western Hemlock Zone such a special place. I know of nowhere else on the entire planet where a single species of tree so dominates a forest and over such a vast area as does Douglas-fir here in Western Oregon. It grows on both sides of the Cascades, but on the east side of the Cascades, it's generally not a dominant tree in the forests, whereas on the west side, it's the other way around. Most places in Western Oregon, you look off from a ridgetop in the West Cascades or the Coast Range and you look at ridge after ridge after ridge after ridge. And all those treetops, or 95+% of them that you're seeing, are Douglas-fir. And it's not because they're plantations, even though some of them might be, but even in the absence of cutting and replanting with Douglas-fir, the natural forest around here is dominated by Douglas-fir. But Douglas-fir is a relatively recent arrival in the landscape here. Until about 12,000 years ago, Douglas-fir was apparently nowhere to be found in most of Western Oregon. Nobody knows where it hung out during the peak of the last ice age. None of this area where we're talking about here was glaciated, but the climate was different. Different trees grew here. It was a much more open landscape with a lot of grasses and ferns and bracken fern and so forth. So perhaps, some Douglas-fir, it already existed on the planet. Maybe it hung out in a remote valley or two in the Siskiyous in southwestern Oregon, but we don't know. At any rate, it wasn't until about 12,000 years ago that we start seeing Douglas-fir commonly in the pollen record here in Western Oregon. And then from 12,000 years ago until the present, it just dominates everywhere. Suddenly after the Ice Age, conditions were just right for Douglas-fir to take over the landscape. So again, a fairly recent arrival, 10 or 12,000 years ago, isn't that long ago in geologic terms. Douglas-fir, its botanical name is Pseudotsuga menziesii. It's not what we call a true fir of the genus Abies. Its botanical name actually means, Pseudotsuga means false hemlock. When this tree was first discovered or described in the 1800s, people first thought it was a spruce, then they thought it was a hemlock, and then they finally settled on, well, this is a totally new genus, and we'll call it false hemlock, Pseudotsuga. So that's why when we write the word Douglas-fir, we write it with a hyphen, Douglas-fir, because it's not a true fir like grand fir or subalpine fir or noble fir. The tree has relatively long, relatively blunt needles, and on branchlets out in the sun, the needles go all the way around the branchlet, just kind of like a bottle brush. It has, for 7 or 8 months of the year, it has very distinctive buds, which are relatively long, very pointed compared to other conifers that grow around here. and a reddish brown color. The cones themselves are particularly, the seed cones are particularly distinctive because in between all the cone scales, the rounded woody-like scales, are these three-pronged papery-like protrusions that are called bracts. And these three-pronged bracts are peculiar to Douglas-fir, and so no other conifer we have around here has a seed cone just like this. Virtually everywhere in western Oregon, Douglas-fir dominates the upper canopy. And most places you don't see any seedlings, Douglas-fir seedlings, at all on the forest floor. That's because Douglas-fir, well, it's just developed in such a way that it needs, number one, mineral soil on which to germinate. It can't germinate on top of moss and duff and rotting needles and so forth. And it needs a lot of sunshine to thrive. And so Douglas-fir is a species that's dependent on an open landscape for being able to colonize. And so eventually in these forests, with no baby Douglas-firs coming up, the older Douglas-firs after centuries will die out and a new forest will develop. No discussion of Douglas-fir is complete without talking about fire. You can see that when the last fire burned through here about 100, 110 years ago, that it didn't kill the top of the tree. It was a ground fire, at least in this part of the stand, and it charred the outer bark here. In the last 100 years or so, the tree has continued to grow outwards. Bark grows from the inside out, and so the outermost ridges still have the charcoal on them. It's biologically inert, and so it doesn't, rot off. All the new bark that's developed in the last 110 years is, of course, it has no charcoal on it at all. In the absence of fire, Douglas-fir would eventually disappear, and these forests around here would become western hemlock forests. But as far as we know, in western Oregon, western hemlock forests have never existed because Douglas-fir persists so long in the canopy that sometime during its life the clock gets reset and new Doug-fir start to grow again. Most people think that all of western Oregon looked like this before the arrival of European Americans in the mid-1800s, but that wasn't the case. The forests of western Oregon were a mosaic of different stand ages and stand types. This type of stand here, what we these days call old growth, grew over some of western Oregon and maybe much of western Oregon, but the rest of the land was in younger stages of forest, post-fire forest that were 10 years after the fire, or 50 years, or 150 years. And parts of western Oregon, of course, like the Willamette Valley, particularly the southern half of the Willamette Valley, were non-forested. They were grassland, or mostly treeless grassland, that had been maintained for thousands of years by the series of cultures that burned the landscape to keep it open. This particular stand here is a textbook example of old-growth Douglas-fir western hemlock forest, defined by 4 characteristics. Number 1, large live trees. And by large live trees, that means a diameter of at least 3 feet, height of 150 or taller. And in this zone, the western hemlock zone, the large live trees are Douglas-fir. Douglas-fir dominates the canopy. The second criterion is large dead trees, standing trees, snags, minimum of say 3 feet in diameter or a minimum height of 30, 40, 50 feet, not just a stump. So large live trees, large dead trees. Then large logs on the ground, and these are Douglas-fir that have fallen down or were killed in the last fire and are in various stages of decomposition. The fourth criterion for an old-growth forest is a multi-layered, multi-species canopy. That is, younger forests will have just all the green on the top, like a 50 or 80-year-old Douglas-fir forest will be lots of green up there, and then empty trunks, and then just sword ferns and moss, and maybe a few shrubs on the forest floor. But here, there's green at every level. We have green up there, we have green in the middle canopy, we have green foliage, younger trees in the lower canopy. So it has multiple layers and multiple species. Again, the upper canopy is all Douglas-fir. The middle canopy is a mixture of western hemlock and western red cedar. and the lower canopy is also a mixture, but most of it's western hemlock. So again, large live trees, large dead trees, standing dead, large logs on the ground, and a multi-layered, multi-species canopy. Old growth is not just big trees, it's an ecosystem. And so when you see a single large tree surrounded by young trees, that's not an old growth stand. Again, this is an old growth stand here because it meets all four of those criteria, and there are all kinds of other critters that are associated with it that you wouldn't find in younger stands. Regarding the trees themselves, again, the Douglas-fir, the biggest trees here, the oldest trees, are certainly 400 years old, probably 500, and maybe 600 or even 700 years old. This particular stand has more than one age class of Douglas-fir because some of them survived a fire that came through here and others got started. We might have a 600-year age class and a 400-year-old age class. The other two trees in the canopy here are western hemlock and western red cedar. Western hemlock, or Tsuga heterophylla, is, after all, the tree for which this zone is named. Forest ecologists name zones according to what tree will eventually dominate the forest after it reaches a stable stage. If this stand or any stand in the western hemlock zone were undisturbed for a long enough period of time, no fires, no disease, landslides, cutting, that these stands would turn into a forest of western hemlock without any Douglas-fir anymore. But it's not there yet. This is just the old growth stage, which is heading towards a later stage that would be dominated by western hemlock, but just is never reached here because a fire is going to reset the clock at some point. Western hemlock has much shorter needles, much blunter needles, flatter needles than Douglas-fir, very light colored underneath on the underside of the foliage, and relatively small cones, never over an inch. These are wet cones, so they're not fully open, but they're about 3/4 of an inch long and typical for western hemlock. The trees in this stand, the hemlocks, are anywhere from a few years old to 100 or maybe 150. And then the third tree in this stand, which is relatively common right here, is western red cedar, about which we'll speak in more detail a little later. Another characteristic of these older forests is, well, what these days we call their structural complexity. That is, they both vertically and horizontally, there's a lot of heterogeneity here. And I already said vertically there's different species and greenery at different layers of the canopy. But horizontally too, some parts of the stand, such as the one I'm in here, are very open. The ground is covered with oxalis and moss, and a stump here, a snag there, a green tree there. But you go over a little bit and maybe a tree or two fell down, and it's opened up the stand there, and now that part of the stand is filled with vine maple and devil's club or other shrubs. So in a younger stand, there would be just moss and sword fern for maybe acres. But in an older stand like this, it develops a lot more complexity, and we see it all around us here. Although much old growth, or what we these days call old growth, has been cut, especially since the end of World War II, there are still enormous areas of it in western Oregon. The old growth ecosystem is just one kind of stand type in a mosaic of stand types that we find in the western hemlock zone. So let's take a look now at some of those other stand types. We're now atop a 2,000-foot high ridge here in the West Cascades in a stand of relatively young trees, almost all of which are Douglas-fir, and on a site that apparently has never had any or many large trees on it before, and has evidently not had at least a closed canopy forest on it. Any ridgetop is more susceptible to lightning-started wildfire than a valley bottom or a relatively cool, moist, north-facing slope. We look around here, and despite the difference in trunk diameter in a lot of the firs, they're all between, say, 75 and 100 years old, coming in after the last or the most recent fire here, seeding in from some of the bigger trees that are around here, but there weren't many big trees. Those trees survived that ground fire, seeded in, hasn't been a fire since, and so over time, just competing for sunlight, nutrients, and water, some of these 75 to 100-year-old seedlings have gotten bigger than others. We also look around here for evidence of what kind of forest or what kind of trees, what size trees were here in the past. And we look at the microtopography of the site, and it's very, very even everywhere we look. We don't see pits and mounds of soil as we would see on a site where there were older trees in the past or for a long time in the past, because older trees sometimes tip over, they lift up their root wad. Where the root wad was is a big pit. As the root wad rots, it drops a pile of soil next to that pit, and so you have this humpy, bumpy pit and mound topography on sites like that. But here we don't see that at all, and so that's evidence that for probably thousands of years there have never been big trees here or many big trees, and there certainly wasn't, or evidently wasn't, a closed canopy forest of older trees for a long, long time. One thing we notice in this stand compared to the old growth stand we were in earlier is that it's just starting to open up here. There isn't a lot of understory yet, but what is moving in is some western hemlock, and in clearings like in back of me here, there's a little cluster of Pacific dogwood which have moved in the last, 30, 40 years. And little by little, as this stand continues to mature, we'll see more conifers and other trees and shrubs moving into the under canopy. But for now, it's a relatively open under canopy, which makes it extra easy for us to look around and see, as I said a minute ago, see that even landscape indicating how new this forest is. We're now in a stand of Douglas-fir at about the 2,000-foot elevation here in the West Cascades, upper McKenzie River drainage. And to a casual passerby, this stand looks not unlike a plantation you might see on private land, a tree farm. Trees are almost all Douglas-fir. They're more or less evenly spaced. They're about the same size and age. But in fact, this is a pristine stand that's never been cut, that's developed naturally following a wildfire of maybe 70 or 80 years ago. And if you look closely, all the trees aren't Douglas-fir, but 95 or 98% are. There are a few western white pines, a couple grand firs, an incense cedar or two. But this is typical of what happens after a wildfire in the western hemlock zone, is the first tree to come in is Douglas-fir, first conifer to come in. And during its first 10, 20, 50, 100 years, it goes through a stage where the canopy is relatively tight with young firs. Other trees haven't moved into the under canopy yet, or not many of them have. The under canopy itself doesn't have that many shrubs. It's a lot of moss and ferns and so forth. And so in terms of biological diversity, this kind of stand is relatively ho-hum. But this kind of stand is important in the mosaic of stand types that a healthy forest in the western hemlock zone needs to have. One of the conifers that's relatively common in the western hemlock zone but never dominates a stand is western red cedar, Thuya placata. It's a common tree in older forests in the under canopy, especially on moister sites. Usually it doesn't grow in single species groves, but some places like this one, which is very wet in the wintertime, there are no Douglas firs, there are relatively few western hemlocks, and there's lots of western red cedar. One of the distinctive features about it is its very broadly buttressed trunk at the base compared to Douglas-fir or western hemlock or the other conifers we see in western Oregon. Also, it has relatively thin bark. It doesn't have deeply ridged and furrowed bark that you'd see on an older Douglas-fir, and the bark peels off fairly easy. So they're very fire susceptible. In the event that a western red cedar is able to escape fire or survive fire for a few centuries, they can reach phenomenal size. Indeed, this particular individual here has been lucky. There has been a fire through here most recently in about 1890, and it charred a considerable portion of the trunk. And in fact, the trunk for the first 40 or so feet is completely hollow. But enough of the bark survived that it's been able over the last 110 years or so to try to close over that wound. And so the tree is still surprisingly healthy. It's just a skin of live wood around an empty trunk at this point with a lot of weight up on top. But it's still standing, and hopefully it will be able to stand for a few more decades. This particular individual here may be as young as 500, maybe 700. It's hard to tell. The cones of western red cedar are very distinctive. They're very small, first of all, and they're not a tight cone like a Douglas-fir or a western hemlock or pines and so forth. They actually look like, here's a dry one here that actually looks like a little rosebud. All of the so-called cedars that grow in Oregon's forests, western red cedar, incense cedar, Port Orford cedar, Alaska yellow cedar, have the same type of foliage. Scale-like needles, flattened or oppressed along the twigs. It looks kind of ferny. Western red cedar has a very two-dimensional branchlet. If you look at it sideways, you can hardly see it. It's that flat. Western red cedar also has quite extensive white or lightish markings on the underside of the branchlet. And of course, if you pull one off and smell it, there's nothing that smells quite like western red cedar. One kind of forested stand that exists quite abundantly in the western hemlock zone but doesn't generally include any conifers is a stand that's dominated by red alder, Ulmus rubra. This tree is extremely common, particularly in the Coast Range, but also here in the Cascades, where it comes in right after a fire or right after an area has been cut over. In other words, on what we call disturbed ground. Many people, when they drive back and forth from the coast or into the Cascades, they'll see trees like this, and even if they're from around here, but especially if they're from the Midwest or back east, they think that these are birch trees because the trunks appear very light in color. But what we're actually seeing on the trunks is, well, there are mosses here, of course, but there are a lot of lichens, and these white patches are lichens. The actual bark of alder is a very dark gray. It's a broadleaf deciduous tree, that is, it loses all of its leaves in fall, and its leaf is doubly toothed. That is, it has big teeth on it, and each big tooth has smaller teeth on it as well. This is a leaf from a young tree, a very vigorous tree, so it's a little larger than average. One of the peculiarities of red alder is that it has on its roots, it produces these nodules in which a bacterium lives that's able to take atmospheric nitrogen, which isn't available for plant growth, and convert it to a form that is suitable for plant growth. And since alders typically invade or colonize sites that have been seriously disturbed, often those sites, a major nutrient that they're lacking is nitrogen, a nutrient that's extremely important for good plant growth. And that's why you'll see sometimes on a cut bank along a highway, say Douglas-fir move in, or western red cedar, or even hemlock, and their foliage looks very yellow, and that's because the trees are lacking nitrogen. Those soils there that have been just scraped off for the cut bank don't have enough nitrogen in them to really allow the trees to grow vigorously. So alder moves in after the disturbance. It makes its own nitrogen with the help of the bacterium that's living in the nodules, and so the alder really thrives. It pumps nitrogen back into the soil and prepares the soil for the next stage of forest succession, as we call it, and that is, the alders will lead to something else, will lead to something else, will lead to climax forest if it lasts that long. And so it's easy to understand sometimes that in an alder stand you'll see western red cedar or western hemlock moving into the stand, because those trees can come in, germinate on ground that's covered with moss and leaf litter, and although they might not thrive in the shade, they'll hang out there until the alders, which are relatively short-lived, 40, 50, 60 years, the alder stand starts to break apart, opening up holes to the sky, and then the western hemlock or western red cedar can take off. But Douglas-fir can't come in to an established alder stand. Its seeds can fall here, but as we've discussed, they can't germinate on anything but mineral soil, and there's no mineral soil exposed in an established alder stand. So what are all these Douglas-fir doing in this stand? How did they get started? After the disturbance that occurred here almost 20 years ago, red alder seeded in from the air, very tiny seeds that are windblown for sometimes miles, especially in the wintertime, but also some Douglas-fir seeded in from the nearby stands that weren't cut. And Douglas-fir grows much more slowly than red alder does. And so the red alders took off growing 3 feet, 4 feet a year, and have created a canopy here in 15 or 20 years of trees that are, 50 feet tall? And this Douglas-fir is the same age as the alders, but it's just grown. You can see on the leader here, it's grown 6 inches last year, 4 inches a year before, 4 or 5 inches a year before. If this tree were out in the open, it would be growing 2 or maybe even 3 feet a year. But it's in the under canopy here, it's tolerating it, it's still green, it's waiting for a hole to open. But again, its seed came in at the same time as the red alder seeds came in. The tree, even though it's growing in the under canopy and so forth, it looks like it came in after they did. It didn't. It's the same age as they are. Okay, so let's review. Here are some of the major points you need to remember about the Western Hemlock Zone. First, it's called the Western Hemlock Zone because eventually, in the absence of any major disturbance like wildfire, Douglas-fir will disappear from the upper canopy and the forest will become dominated by Western hemlock, which is waiting in the wings now in the lower canopy. But apparently, this has never happened in Western Oregon because sometime in the long lifespan of Douglas-fir, there's going to be a wildfire that resets the clock, new Douglas-fir come in, and off it goes again. Second, Douglas-fir is a relatively recent arrival upon the scene here in Western Oregon, having become abundant only in the last 10 to 12,000 years. It's a tree that needs mineral soil for germination, that is, it can't germinate on mosses and duff in the forest under canopy, and it needs a lot of sun in order to do really well. Third, the old-growth forest ecosystem never grew everywhere in Western Oregon. There's still quite a bit of it left, and virtually all of it grows on public land. The 4 characteristics of old-growth forest are large live trees, Douglas-fir, large standing dead or snags, large logs on the ground, and a multi-layered, multi-species canopy consisting of Douglas-fir at the top and western hemlock and western red cedar in the middle and lower canopy. Again, old-growth forest is a system, an ecosystem, that's developed in just the last 5,000 years or so. We also looked at stands of trees that are younger than old-growth forest. Old-growth tends to develop only after the Doug-firs are 150 to 200, 250 years in age. So stands of trees that have been growing for less than 150 years after the fire are certainly dominated by Douglas-fir. Some of them don't have any or much western hemlock or western red cedar yet, and yet they're a stage that forests need to go through on their way to old growth, if in fact they ever get there. We also looked at western red cedar stands, which are relatively uncommon and tend to be found in the moistest areas, down near a stream, maybe near a seep on a north-facing slope. Western red cedar is relatively common in the under canopy of older forests around here, but nowhere does it dominate a site except on the wettest soils. We looked at a red alder stand. Red alder comes in on many sites, especially in the Coast Range, but also in the West Cascades. After a fire, the seeds by the thousands, very tiny seeds, airborne, come in and often will dominate a site for 30, 40, 50 years after a fire. But meanwhile, Douglas-fir that came in at the same time that are kind of stunted in the undercanopy of the red alder stands, those will, whenever the alder stand starts to fall apart, the Douglas-fir will then take off and can become a Douglas-fir forest there. Also, after the alder stand has become established, both western hemlock and western red cedar are capable of seeding into the undercanopy of that established alder stand because those seeds can germinate on moss and decaying leaves and so forth, unlike Douglas-fir. It has to come in with the alder, not after the alder's already been established. So it's this mosaic of stands of different ages and stages and species that makes the western hemlock zone the biologically rich and aesthetically interesting area that it is.